Good evening, sir, ma'am. Such a pleasure to have you with us tonight. May I start you off with a bottle of our finest champagne? He asked, his voice smooth and eager to please. The couple barely acknowledged him, nodding as they scrolled through their phones. Still, the waiter hovered nearby, ready to shower them with attention, ensuring they received only the best service. It was a clear contrast, how he treated those he deemed *worthy* versus those he assumed weren't. Keanu leaned back in his chair, watching it all unfold. He wasn't angry. If anything, he was curious. How long would the act continue? How far would this waiter go in making sure the wrong kind of people never felt welcome? A few minutes later, the waiter returned with Keanu's drink, setting it down a little too hard, some of the liquid splashing onto the table. He didn't apologize. "Food's coming soon," he muttered, already turning to walk away. Keanu glanced at the small spill but said nothing. Instead, he picked up his glass, taking a slow sip. The night was still young. Meanwhile, another staff member, a younger waitress who had been watching the interaction from afar, hesitated near the bar. She had worked here for only a few months, but even in that short time, she had noticed the way things worked. The favoritism, the judgment, and tonight, something about it didn't sit right with her. She had recognized the man at table 7 the moment he walked in. Keanu Reeves. She had seen him in movies, heard stories about his kindness, about how he was one of the rare celebrities who treated everyone with respect. And yet, here he was, being treated like he didn't belong. She debated whether to say something. It wasn't her place, and she didn't want to cause trouble. But something told her this night was about to take a turn. As Keanu waited, he noticed the restaurant manager emerge from the back, adjusting his tie as he surveyed the room. He was a middle-aged man, someone who prided himself on maintaining a flawless reputation for the establishment, and yet, even he seemed oblivious to what was happening under his own roof. Keanu had never made a big deal about being the owner. He wasn't the type to flaunt power. But tonight, he was beginning to wonder if a reminder was necessary, if it was time for a few changes. And as the smug waiter continued serving guests, still unaware of the reality about to unfold, Keanu simply sat back and waited. The night wasn't over yet. The clinking of glasses, the soft hum of conversation, and the distant notes of a live pianist filled the restaurant, but Keanu remained still, observing everything. The waiter who had dismissed him continued to breeze through the dining area, flashing smiles at wealthy guests, making effortless small talk, and ensuring that their every need was met. It was a performance, one Keanu had seen before in places where status mattered more than kindness. Across the room, the younger waitress kept stealing glances at Keanu. She had heard about him, stories of his generosity, his humility, the way he always treated people with respect, no matter who they were. And now, watching how he was being treated, she felt uneasy. She knew the waiter was in for a shock, but the real question was how Keanu would handle it. Would he lash out? Would he demand an apology? Or would he simply walk away, leaving them all to continue in their ignorance? Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the chef, an older man with a sharp eye and years of experience, was plating Keanu's order. Unlike the front-of-house staff, he knew exactly who Keanu was. He had met him once, briefly, when the restaurant first opened. Back then, Keanu had been involved in every decision, the menu, the layout, the hiring process. But as time went on, the business was left in the hands of managers and staff who had slowly shifted the atmosphere into something colder, something less welcoming. And now, seeing the way Keanu's order had been handled with little care, the chef felt a twinge of frustration. He turned to one of the kitchen staff. "Make sure that plate is perfect," he muttered. "I have a feeling we're gonna need it." Back in the dining area, the waiter strolled past Keanu's table once again, still carrying that same air of arrogance. He had already decided that this man wouldn't tip well, if he could even afford to pay at all. And so, when he finally returned with a plate, he set it down without a word, not even bothering to ask if Keanu needed anything else. Keanu looked at the dish, It was beautifully prepared, just as he expected. He picked up his fork, about to take a bite, when a familiar voice interrupted. "My apologies for the delay, sir." The dim glow of chandeliers reflected off the polished marble floors of an exclusive, high-end restaurant in Los Angeles. This wasn't just any fine dining spot. It was the kind of place where celebrities dined in hushed elegance, where waiters carried themselves with an air of superiority, and where a single meal could cost more than most people's rent. Tonight, a quiet figure walked in, dressed in his usual understated style: dark jeans, a simple black jacket, and an unassuming presence that made him nearly blend into the background. Most people wouldn't look twice. Most people wouldn't realize they were in the presence of Keanu Reeves. The waiter certainly didn't. As Keanu took a seat at a corner table, he glanced around, taking in the atmosphere. It was the kind of place that valued appearances more than anything else. The kind of place where the wrong outfit could mean second-class treatment. And tonight, it seemed, Keanu was about to experience that firsthand. A tall, sharply dressed waiter approached, his expression already tight with judgment. From the moment he laid eyes on Keanu's simple clothes, he made an assumption. This was just another nobody who had wandered in by mistake. Someone who didn't belong. His lips curled slightly as he handed over the menu, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you sure you were in the right place?" he asked, barely masking his disdain. Keanu, always the picture of patience, simply smiled. "Yeah, I think so." The waiter let out a soft, mocking chuckle. "We have a strict reservation policy here, and our prices, well, they're not exactly affordable asterisk." His eyes flicked over Keanu's jacket, his worn-out boots. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere. Less exclusive asterisk." Keanu didn't react. Not in anger, not in frustration. He had encountered arrogance before, and he had long since learned that the best response was no response at all. Instead, he simply nodded. "That's good to know. I'd still like to stay." But the waiter wasn't done. He sighed dramatically, as if dealing with the biggest inconvenience of his night. "All right," he said, barely holding back an eye roll. "What would you to order?" Keanu took his time scanning the menu, though he already knew what he wanted. He had been here many times before. He had built this place from the ground up. Every dish, every detail, every element of the restaurant was something he had helped design. But he wasn't about to reveal that, not yet. "I'll start with the chef's special," he said, handing back the menu. The waiter took it with a smirk. "You sure? That dish alone is a couple $100. His tone made it clear. He didn't believe Keanu could afford it. Keanu only nodded. "Sounds perfect." The waiter scoffed under his breath before walking away, muttering something to a colleague. Keanu heard it, something about wasting a table, and these types never tip. Still, he remained calm, watching the night unfold with quiet amusement. What the waiter didn't know was that the man he had just insulted wasn't just another customer. He wasn't some lost, broke diner who had wandered into the wrong place. He was the owner. The very reason this restaurant existed. And soon the waiter was going to find that out in the most unexpected way possible. This introduction sets up the story with tension, intrigue, and a satisfying build-up while keeping it natural and human-centric. "Would you like any tweaks to match your specific style?" The waiter strutted away, shaking his head as he whispered something to another server. They both chuckled, throwing a quick glance back at Keanu, as if he was some clueless fool who had no idea what he had walked into. Keanu remained relaxed, his fingers lightly tapping against the polished wooden table. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, the kind of attitude that placed value on appearances rather than character. It didn't bother him, not personally, but it did make him wonder how many other guests had been treated like this. How many people had come in here, excited to experience a special evening, only to be made to feel small. The restaurant had once been built on something different. When Keanu had invested in this place, his vision wasn't just about luxury. It was about creating a space that welcomed people, where great food and great company mattered more than designer clothes and flashy watches. But somewhere along the way, that idea had gotten lost. And tonight, he was seeing it firsthand. Across the room, a well-dressed couple had just been seated. The same waiter who had been so dismissive with Keanu suddenly changed his tone completely. His shoulders straightened, his smile widened, and his voice took on an overly polite, almost rehearsed charm. The waiter's face had gone pale. He looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape, but there was none. The manager's expression hardened, and he turned to Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, I assure you, this is not what we stand for." Keanu held up a hand, stopping him. "Then prove it," he said simply. The weight of his words hung in the air. The restaurant was at a tipping point, and everyone knew it. Something had to change, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The weight of Keanu's words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone in the restaurant. The manager swallowed hard, glancing between Keanu and the guests who had spoken up. He knew there was no easy way out of this. The truth had been exposed, and there was no covering it up. The waiter, still standing frozen in place, clenched his jaw. His face burned with humiliation, but for the first time that night, he didn't have a snarky remark or an excuse. He knew he had messed up, badly. But even now, he was hoping for a way to fix it, to walk away without facing the consequences. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but firm. "What happens next isn't about me," he said, his voice steady. "It's about this place. About the people who come here expecting a great experience, no matter who they are." He looked at the manager. "So, what are you going to do about it?" The manager hesitated, visibly sweating now. He glanced at the guests, at the staff, at the waiter. Everyone was watching him, waiting. He had no choice but to act. He let out a sharp breath and turned to the waiter. "You're done here." His voice was clipped, decisive. "Get your things and leave." The waiter's eyes widened. "Wait, There's nothing to argue," the manager cut in, shaking his head. "You don't just represent yourself here. You represent this restaurant, my restaurant, his restaurant." He gestured toward Keanu. "And you've made it clear you don't respect that responsibility." The room was dead silent as the words landed. The waiter took a step back, his face twisting in frustration. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. But there was no way out. His shoulders sagged, and with one last glance around the room, he turned and walked toward the back, disappearing from sight. The tension in the restaurant seemed to loosen slightly, but Keanu wasn't finished. He turned back to the manager. "Firing one person doesn't change the bigger issue," he said. The manager nodded, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. "I understand, and I take full responsibility. This place needs to do better." He exhaled, rubbing his temple. "We need to start over." Keanu studied him for a moment, then finally nodded. "Good." A murmur spread through the guests, some nodding in approval, others still processing everything that had happened. The young waitress, standing off to the side, looked relieved but also uncertain. She had spoken up, but she wasn't sure what it meant for her future at the restaurant. Keanu seemed to read her thoughts. He turned to her and smiled. "Thank you for saying something. That takes courage." Her cheeks reddened slightly, and she nodded. I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Keanu's expression softened. "People like you are exactly what this place needs." The manager, realizing the truth in Keanu's words, turned to the young waitress. "We'll be making changes here," he said, "and I want people who actually care about the guests to be part of that. If you're willing, I'd like you to take on a bigger role." Her eyes widened. "Me?" "You stood up for what's right," Keanu said. "That's leadership." The waitress looked between them, shock and gratitude mixing on her face. I'd love that." A quiet applause broke out in the restaurant, and for the first time that night, the tension truly lifted. Keanu leaned back in his chair, finally picking up his fork again. He took a bite of his food and smiled. Now this asterisk is how a restaurant should feel. The manager exhaled, relieved. The guests returned to their meals, now part of a story they'd tell for years. And as the young waitress stood a little taller, knowing everything had changed, Keanu simply enjoyed his dinner, just as he had originally intended. But as he glanced around the restaurant one last time, he couldn't help but wonder. How many other places had lost sight of what truly mattered? As the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted back to normal, there was a noticeable change in energy. Guests who had once felt uncomfortable or overlooked now dined with a newfound ease, exchanging glances and small smiles as if they had just witnessed something truly meaningful. The young waitress, still standing near Keanu's table, seemed almost overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. But beneath her initial shock, there was a quiet sense of pride. She had spoken up, and it had mattered. Keanu took another bite of his meal, savoring it now in a way he hadn't earlier. The food had always been excellent, but tonight it tasted different. Maybe because he knew something had changed. Maybe because the place itself had taken a step toward being what it was meant to be, a restaurant that welcomed people rather than judged them. The manager, still visibly shaken from the ordeal, approached the table cautiously. "Mr. Reeves, I just want to say again, I'm truly sorry for what happened tonight," he said. His voice was steady, but carried a note of humility. "This isn't how I want my staff to treat people, and I promise, things will be different." Keanu looked up at him and gave a small nod. "It's not about me," he said simply. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through that." The manager exhaled, nodding. "You're right, and I'll make sure of it." With that, he turned to the young waitress. "We'll talk tomorrow about your new role. I think you'll be a great fit." She blinked, almost as if she couldn't believe it was real. Then a wide smile spread across her face. "Thank you," she said softly. As the manager walked away, Keanu noticed a few guests quietly approaching his table. A middle-aged woman placed a hand over her heart as she spoke. "I just wanted to say, that was incredible. People like you, with your status, don't have to do things like this. But you did, and that means something." Keanu smiled warmly. "Everyone deserves respect. It's really that simple." A younger man standing nearby chimed in. "Honestly, this place always felt a little unwelcoming before, but I think tonight might have actually changed that." Keanu nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but he wasn't looking for praise. He had just wanted to enjoy a meal in peace, and instead, he had ended up uncovering a much bigger issue. That's how life worked sometimes. As the guests returned to their seats, the restaurant slowly settled into a more comfortable rhythm. The tension that had once loomed in the air had disappeared, replaced by an unexpected warmth. Conversations picked up, laughter drifted through the room, and the restaurant finally felt like a place people wanted to be. The young waitress, still beaming from her unexpected promotion, came back to Keanu's table one last time. "Is there anything else I can get you, Mr. Reeves?" she asked, her voice lighter now. Keanu thought for a moment, then grinned. "Just the check, and keep up the great work." As she walked away, Keanu leaned back in his chair, taking one final glance around. Tonight hadn't gone the way he expected, but maybe it had turned out even better. With a satisfied sigh, he stood up, left a generous tip, and made his way toward the exit. As he stepped outside, the cool night air greeted him, carrying with it the echoes of an evening that no one inside would soon forget. And as he walked down the quiet street, one thought lingered in his mind. Sometimes, the most unexpected moments are the ones that make the biggest difference. Keanu looked up. The restaurant manager had finally noticed him, but not because he had realized who he was. No, it was because the young waitress had quietly mentioned something to him. The manager studied Keanu for a moment, as if trying to place his face. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression, like he knew he had seen this man before, but couldn't quite remember where. "Is everything to your liking?" the manager asked, forcing a polite smile. Keanu nodded. So far, so good. The manager hesitated, glancing at the waiter, who stood nearby with an impatient expression. He still hadn't caught on. The younger waitress, still standing at a distance, felt her heart race. She could see it now, the slow realization creeping over the manager's face. He was putting the pieces together, remembering the face, the voice, the presence of the man sitting in front of him. The waiter, however, remained oblivious. If anything, he looked annoyed that so much attention was suddenly being given to a customer he had already deemed unimportant. The tension in the air thickened. A few guests had noticed the strange shift, the way the manager had suddenly stiffened, the way the waitress kept watching from a distance, the way Keanu remained perfectly calm, despite everything. The manager took a slow breath, then turned to the waiter. "Do you know who this is?" The waiter barely glanced at Keanu. "Just some guy who probably walked in here thinking he could." The manager cut him off. "This is Mr. Reeves." His voice was tight now, his face pale. The waiter frowned. "So?" The manager exhaled sharply, as if debating how much to say in front of the guests. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "He owns this restaurant." For the first time that night, the waiter's smug expression cracked. And Keanu, still sitting calmly, simply picked up his fork and took a bite of his food, as if none of it had ever been a big deal to him. But the truth was, the night was far from over. The real consequences were only just beginning. The restaurant fell into a heavy silence. The clatter of silverware, the low murmur of conversations, everything seemed to pause as the weight of the manager's words settled over the waiter. The color drained from his face. He blinked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Keanu Reeves? Asterisk of this restaurant." For a split second, the waiter looked at his manager, waiting for some kind of clarification, some indication that this was all just a misunderstanding. But the tightness in the manager's jaw, the barely concealed panic in his eyes, said everything. This was real. Keanu remained perfectly composed, taking another slow bite of his food. He didn't look angry. He didn't look smug. If anything, he looked disappointed. And somehow that made everything worse. The young waitress, still standing off to the side, shifted uncomfortably. She could feel the weight of the moment, the way the entire atmosphere of the restaurant had changed in an instant. Other servers had stopped moving, their eyes flicking between Keanu and the waiter, waiting to see what would happen next. The waiter finally swallowed, forcing a weak chuckle. He tried to find his words, but none came. The manager cleared his throat, stepping in. "Mr. Reeves, I sincerely apologize for any disrespect you've experienced tonight." His voice was careful, overly polite now. He was scrambling, trying to contain the situation before it spiraled any further. Keanu set his fork down, his movements slow and deliberate. He met the manager's eyes, then turned his gaze back to the waiter, who was now shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Tell me something," Keanu said, his voice calm but firm. "Is this how you treat all your guests?" The waiter opened his mouth, then closed it, his hands clenched at his sides, his mind racing for an excuse, a way out. But there wasn't one. Keanu continued, his tone steady. "I've been sitting here for almost an hour watching how you treat people, and I have to say, it's been interesting." The silence in the restaurant grew even heavier. Some of the guests had noticed what was happening now, their conversations slowing as they strained to listen. Keanu glanced toward the young waitress, then at the chef, who had now stepped just outside the kitchen, arms crossed as he observed the scene. He had a knowing look in his eyes, one that said he had seen this kind of thing before. Keanu let out a small sigh, looking back at the waiter. "Tell me, when did this place become about judging people instead of serving them?" The words hit like a slap. The waiter's breath stuttered, and he looked at the manager again, as if hoping for help. But the manager had no words. He was just as frozen, just as uncertain about how to handle the moment. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The sheer weight of who he was not as a celebrity, but as a person, was enough. The younger waitress swallowed hard, feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Relief because finally someone had called it out. Anxiety because she had no idea what Keanu was going to do next. The waiter tried again, his voice weaker this time. I didn't know. Keanu tilted his head slightly. And if I wasn't who I am, he asked. If I really had just been a random guy walking in off the street? He paused, letting the question sink in. Would you still have treated me like this? The waiter's silence was the only answer needed. The manager took a sharp breath, stepping forward. Mr. Reeves, please, let me assure you, this is not how we typically operate. Keanu looked at him. Then maybe you should check in more often. The manager flinched at the honesty in his words. The tension in the restaurant had reached its peak. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the guests who had been trying to enjoy their expensive meals were now fully aware that they were witnessing something important. Keanu finally leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving the waiter. And in that moment, it was clear. Something was about to happen. The question was what ? And the entire restaurant was holding its breath, waiting to find out. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The waiter shifted uncomfortably under Keanu's steady gaze, his confidence crumbling with each passing second. The entire restaurant seemed frozen in time, waiting for what would happen next. The manager opened his mouth, as if about to speak again, but before he could, another voice cut through the tension. Excuse me, but I did notice something strange earlier. Heads turned as the young waitress took a hesitant step forward. Her voice was softer than the manager's, but somehow it carried more weight. She glanced nervously between Keanu and the waiter before continuing. I saw how he treated you, and honestly, he's done it before. The waiter snapped his head toward her, his expression twisting in shock. What are you talking about? His voice was sharp, defensive. She swallowed hard, but didn't back down. You always judge people before they even sit down. If they don't look like they belong, you make sure they feel like they don't. I've seen you turn guests away for no reason, talk down to them, rush them through their meals. And not just him. She gestured toward Keanu, her hands trembling slightly. Others too. You act like this place is only for the rich, but that's not how it's supposed to be. A murmur rippled through the restaurant. Guests exchanged glances, whispering amongst themselves. Some seemed uncomfortable, while others nodded in quiet agreement. The energy in the room shifted, and suddenly, it wasn't just about Keanu anymore. The manager turned to the waitress, his expression unreadable. Why didn't you say anything before? She let out a shaky breath. Because I thought this was normal here. Her voice wavered, but she stood her ground. But tonight, I realized it's not asterisk, or at least it shouldn't be. The waiter scoffed, shaking his head. Oh, come on, you're blowing this out of proportion. His voice was laced with desperation now, his earlier arrogance slipping away. He turned to the manager, then to Keanu. Look, I didn't know who he was. If I I wouldn't have. Keanu's eyes darkened, just for a fraction of a second. That's exactly the problem, he said quietly. The waiter froze, realizing his mistake too late. He had just admitted everything in one breath. The manager pinched the bridge of his nose, as if trying to process the disaster unfolding in front of him. But before he could say anything, another voice chimed in. I actually had a bad experience here too. An older man at a nearby table spoke up. His suit was well-tailored, his demeanor refined, but his expression was troubled. Last time I came with my daughter, we were rushed through our meal, given the worst table, and ignored most of the night. I assumed it was just an off night, but now I wonder. Another guest nodded. Same here. I brought my mother for her birthday, and we were made to feel like we didn't belong. I didn't say anything because, well, it's a fancy place. I figured maybe we didn't belong. A wave of unease swept through the room. This wasn't just one waiter's mistake. This was a pattern, a culture. Keanu exhaled slowly, letting everything sink in. He hadn't expected tonight to turn into this asterisk. He had come in hoping to have a quiet meal, but instead, he had uncovered something bigger, something that went beyond just one bad interaction.